Ever since NVIDIA announced NVENC new, I've actually been really interested in its overall quality, more so than anything else. And I looked at a lot of initial reports. I actually did some tests early on. And for me, I still had some questions. And so what I broke it down to was, how is my resolution holding up over time? Is the motion in the image affecting my video quality of my camera? Am I losing sharpness and clarity on text that's actually inside the game when I'm streaming? And so my initial tests, the quality isn't exactly 100% one-to-one from NVENC new to x264. Now, both technologies have their own issues. Some are better at fast motion. Some actually pick up text better in motion. Some handle bright flashes better than others. And I wanted to take a deeper dive into this because I continually have the conversation of NVENC isn't the end all be all for everybody. And for the longest time, I've been telling people, if you have a high-end PC with 8 cores or more, your best bet is probably running x264. It is higher quality than NVENC new, and your PC has plenty of cores to handle it alongside gaming. Most games only utilize 4 cores. However, there are a lot of new games coming out there that are using more. I know Division 2, when you're using DirectX 12, I believe will actually utilize up to 8 cores. And the latest Assassin's Creed, I think will use anything you give it. I have to assume that games moving forward are going to utilize the additional cores that we're actually seeing out of AMD and Intel these days. So that being said, my recommendation has always been, if you have more cores, go with x264. But I never actually stopped to measure the performance of how using x264 on a box with 8 cores or more may actually truly be impacting your performance. And is it affecting your FPS in game? I was always under the belief that if your CPU and your GPU were not getting maxed out, you still had headroom to work and you're not going to see a gain in either way. So considering that in most games, I was not maxing out at 100%, x264 was the way to go for me, and I didn't look back. In this video, I'm putting that to the test. So what we're going to do is break down tests over Division 2, Destiny 2, and Borderlands 3. We're going to look at x264 and NVENC new performance side by side. We're looking at in motion, as well as we'll stop a couple frames and actually see how the image itself is breaking down. Then on top of that, we're going to look at CPU and GPU usage. And I'd like to see how utilizing NVENC or x264 is affecting our actual gameplay. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, I want to start with my own PC specs because that's going to be the benchmark that I'm gauging everything against. This isn't necessarily about going for the highest FPS. What it is establishing a baseline and comparing everything to that baseline. We're going to establish equal comparisons against x264 and NVENC, and I'm not going to change any settings on the computer other than the encoder settings. And I'll run through what my actual setup is, what my PC is, and what the encoder settings that I'm using. First off, my CPU is an i9900KF, and my GPU is a ROG Strix 2080 Ti OC. I do have an overclock on the GPU, but the boost is consistent across all testing. I'll have the exact specs in the description below. My motherboard is a ROG Maximus Hero Xi. There is no overclock. It is the default boost coming from Intel. So it is 4.7 across all cores. And I'm using 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance Pro 3600 speed RAM. I am running XMP, so the memory is running at full speed. Okay, so let's look at the baseline that we set up for this test. First off, we're using Twitch guidelines as far as bitrate and resolution. So I did all of my tests in a resolution and bitrate that anyone from affiliate to partner can run, which is 1600 by 900, 60 frames per second at 6000 kilobits per second for the bitrate. Now for the actual compression specs, I use the NVIDIA NVENC OBS guide. You can see here they outline specifications for bitrate, resolution, and frame rate based on your upload speed, as well as the NVENC encoder settings. They do have a couple of settings outside of the encoder, and we went ahead and adhered to those just to make sure that we're actually following the guidelines. So One of those settings is making sure that game mode is on in Windows. Additionally, you'll want to run OBS or Streamlabs OBS in admin mode. That lets the encoder maintain priority over the game, even if the game is utilizing 100% of your GPU. Now, the actual settings that we're using is NVENC new. It's constant bitrate, so CBR. The bitrate is actually going to be 6,000. Our keyframe interval is going to be 2 because that's what's recommended by Twitch. Preset is going to be set to quality. Profile is going to be set to high. Look ahead will be checked. Psychovisual tuning will be checked. And max B-frames is set to 4. There's going to be a link to this guide in the description below, so you'll be able to see exactly what each of those do. I'm not going to go into the description here because it'll take too long to go through it. Just know that these are my settings. So for x264, we're going to keep the settings as identical as possible to our NVENC new settings, which means that we're going to go with a rate control of CBR, constant bitrate. We're going to go with a bitrate of 6,000. Our keyframe interval is 2. Our CPU usage preset is going to be medium. Our profile is high, and no tune, no other settings. So those are essentially both constant bitrate 6,000, which is what Twitch recommends. So the tests were executed in Division 2, Destiny 2, and Borderlands 3. Now in Division and Borderlands, both of those games actually had their own benchmarks, which was great because we were able to run the same exact tests twice, see the frame rate differences, the CPU, GPU usage, what were our benchmarks, FPS in both of those situations. For Destiny, I actually just went to the EDZ. For those of you that play Destiny, you'll know that that is one of the heavier, I don't know if it's necessarily unoptimized. It does tend to drop in frames quite a bit, and the area is fairly predictable with the Fallen and the Cabal warring against each other. So it's pretty great to get in there. There's a couple of benchmark areas that I've tested a lot for visual accuracy, panning across plane surfaces. There's text in there, which is great. And then once the Cabal ships drop and the Fallen show up, I basically tried to trigger every single effect that we could, from the nades to my super to Warlock melees. Yes, Warlock. Anyways, it's not a perfect test, but I was able to get consistent results across multiple iterations of the test. So for my purposes, I'm going to consider that valid. Now for Division of Borderlands, we were able to get actual benchmark numbers. So for Division, we have benchmark FPS, bench GPU, and bench CPU. For Borderlands, we have average SPF. We have average FPS as well as average frame time. And then in Destiny, I was tracking the task manager for overall CPU and GPU usage and monitoring the in-game FPS monitor, so I can actually see where our frame dips as well as our highest performance in the EDZ was. All right, enough of the details. Let's actually jump in, look at some of this footage, and compare the quality and performance overall. So for each of the games, we saw some really interesting results. In Division, with x264 on, we were looking at 100% CPU usage and 88% GPU usage. Our benchmark FPS came in at 108, our bench GPU was 79, and our bench CPU is 57. Now those are the resources used by the game, but in Task Manager, I was seeing that we were actually maxing out our CPU. Now just to balance things out, I know a lot of people run OBS with preview off. So for each of these tests, I ran them with both preview mode on and off. So with preview mode off in Division, we were still seeing 100% CPU usage, 88% GPU usage, a benchmark FPS of 111, so that actually went up by 3, bench GPU of 81, and a bench CPU of 58. So slightly better performance on the GPU and frames with preview off. It was fairly consistent across multiple runs, but I don't know that 3 frames is going to make me turn my preview off. Personally, for me, I actually like to see what's actually going out on stream because that's the fastest way for me to catch something. Now, swapping over to the NVENC encoder for Division, the CPU usage dropped down to 62%. That's 38% less than actually using x264. I mean, that's massive. I wasn't expecting that large of a difference. The GPU usage actually went down a little bit, 86%. And oddly enough, it was 86% consistent across multiple runs. However, the really interesting thing with Division is, regardless of the CPU usage, I was getting the same benchmarks, FPS, GPU, and CPU. My benchmark FPS came in at 108, my bench GPU came in at 79, and my bench CPU came in at 58, almost identical to the x264 settings. So even though in Division we had massive CPU savings, it didn't actually make a difference in game. So for Division, I would say it's all about quality. Now let's look at Borderlands. Starting with Borderlands x264 test, we're actually seeing CPU usage of 85% and a GPU usage of 90%. Our average FPS was 94.64 with a frame time of 10.57. Now again, turning off the OBS preview didn't make much of a difference here. Again, we're still at 85% CPU usage, 90% GPU usage, 95.99 average FPS. Now, that's literally one frame. Again, not something that's actually going to make me turn off OBS preview. Now with the NVENC encoder, our CPU dropped to 40%. 40%. That's 45% less than x264. I mean, that's even more than Division. That one, like, I was stunned when Division dropped 38%. 45% is insane. Now, our GPU still stayed at 90. However, we got a big boost in FPS. We went from 94.64 to 102.69. That's a significant boost in frames, right? With our average frame time being 9.74. Now, turning off the preview, we actually did get a little bit of a boost here. So CPU came down to only 35%. That's a 50% savings. It's crazy. Our GPU actually went up a little bit, 92%. I'm going to chalk that one up to margin of error. But our average FPS was 103.54. So we actually did see that turning the OBS preview off gets you about one frame. Again, it doesn't really matter. Pretty negligible. But I do think it's crazy the CPU difference in the actual performance boost from x264 to NVENC. We're talking 8 frames. Going from 94 to 102 is a 9% performance boost. That's a big difference. All right, now let's look at Destiny. And this one shocked me the most because this is the game I play the most. And I was not expecting this outcome. So with x264, Destiny's CPU usage was 100%. It was pegged. All cores pegged. My GPU usage, 63%. My lowest FPS was 70 frames per second, and my highest FPS was 157. Now remember, I'm capped at 162, so I'm not actually hitting my cap there. Now turning OBS preview off, CPU still pegged at 100%. GPU is at 54%, so there was a little bit of GPU savings there, but my FPS on the low side was 76, and my FPS on the high side was still at 157, so I wasn't gaining anything on the high end. Now here's what blew my mind. With NVENC, CPU usage in Destiny 2, 58%. And that was 58% consistently across multiple runs. I mean, that was a pretty rock solid number. My GPU usage actually went up 80% and spiking up to 100%. I was getting full utilization. When I was running x264, it wasn't going over 63%. It's crazy to me. And so now our FPS on the low side was 99 with preview on, and 158 on the high side. That right there is 29 more frames in the worst case scenario. And these were very consistent scenarios. Now, one more thing that made a considerable improvement as well was turning preview off. So our CPU and GPU usage was the same as OBS preview off. However, on the low end, I was at 106 frames per second in the worst case scenario. On the high end, I hit 162. So I was able to cap out. Again, I ran these multiple tests through multiple waves, running through the same exact actions several times in a row, pretty much putting my character in the exact same scenarios with the same amount of enemies going through the same paces. Now, is there a margin of error there? Very possibly in this case because it's not a perfect benchmark. However, we can see that in both cases for x264 and NVENC, turning preview off actually increased our low frame per second number. So for x264, our lowest frame per second actually increased from 70 to 76. So that's a 6 frame increase. And on NVENC, it increased from 99 to 106, a 7 frame increase. So across both of those, it was consistent throughout the testing. So all of those numbers actually blew my mind. And it was crazy to see that each game performed differently. In Division, we had a 38% CPU savings, but our benchmark FPS was actually fairly identical across the board. Borderlands, we did see a significant gain just switching to NVENC. And in Destiny, we saw even more. That's almost a 30% gain in performance. I mean, just based on those numbers right there, I'm starting to rethink my stance of image quality is king, because my background in visual effects and post-production makes me very sensitive to graphical quality in games. There's a lot of games I won't play just because I don't like the way they look. It's just me. Call me a visual snob. I don't care. However, the performance hit in Destiny is significant. And it's interesting to see that in Borderlands, we were actually getting a performance boost as well. It's not just saving on resources. So one anomaly that I want to point out in Destiny, with NVENC, where our CPU usage was at 58%, our GPU usage averaged around 80%. But when we were 100% maxed out, GPU usage dropped. And in some cases, it dropped as low as 50%. To me, I actually think that using x264 may actually be bottlenecking my GPU at that point. I can honestly say while playing Destiny, because I'm so used to how the game plays, playing with NVENC actually made the game feel smoother. There were a lot less jitter frames, and everything just felt smoother overall. All right, that's enough numbers. Let's actually take a look at the footage and see how they compare from a visual standpoint. Looking at a side-by-side comparison in Borderlands 3, with this style of artwork in the game, I was actually hard-pressed to find a major difference between NVENC and x264. For the most part, both codecs held up equally well with this art style. If I was going to be extremely nitpicky here, we could zoom in and see that NVENC is slightly sharper in text than some of the signs, but I think it's completely negligible in gameplay. The background detail overall felt very equal between the codecs, and moving between scenes that are in light and dark actually felt really equal across the entire frame. I would say for a game like Borderlands, I really didn't see much of a difference. Moving on to Division, which has a richer visual fidelity, we could start to look at some of the detail. And even here on the seal of the graphic of the plane, both codecs seem to be on a level playing field. However, as we move through the scene, we can start to see separation between x264 and NVENC. Zooming into the fence line across the back of the scene, we could see that on NVENC, the fence lines start to get a little bit muddy. Again, it's a minor detail, but not something that I would think you would notice in gameplay. One thing I started to focus in on are the extreme areas in the scene, the highlights and the shadow areas. x264 seemed to do a better job overall of retaining highlights and shadows. As we move by and see the God rays peer through the scene, NVENC does muddle the highlights a little bit in the God rays. x264, however, got noisy passing through the leaves, while NVENC retained the detail and remained sharp. Now, NVENC is mushing together some of the details in the shadow areas, so we are losing that. Overall, it seems that NVENC compressed low light details usually off in the distance. The highs and lows seem to get muddy, while the high contrast boundaries tend to retain their image quality. Now, I don't think any of these subtle differences are enough to make me change codecs if performance is truly an issue. But now let's go look at Destiny. Overall in Orbit, both codecs actually handled sharp lines and text extremely well. NVENC did prove to have slightly higher contrast on the text, but again, it's nothing of significance. Overall, both suffered from compression artifacts and large fast motion, but NVENC seemed to recover quicker. And again, we can see that x264 retains better detail in low light areas. One thing that was a bit of a concern to me was that NVENC lost a lot of definition in the image during this firefight compared to x264. With a lot of action, flashes, and fast-moving motion going on the screen, x264 seemed to hold the frame better. Now, one additional test I did with Destiny was to actually pull up my stream graphics and see what it looks like with having my camera on stream. A lot of people complain that NVENC will actually blur your camera when there's fast-moving motion in the game. As you can see here, though, there is a bit of a difference. The NVENC camera suffered during fast gameplay motion. x264 does have artifacting on the camera during fast gameplay, but it's not as heavily impacted as NVENC. So overall, I gotta say, I was pretty shocked by these results. I mean, for the longest time, I was completely convinced of the superior image quality of x264. And a lot of that really came down from the fact that the on-screen webcam would tend to suffer pretty heavily when presented with a lot of motion in the game. That being said, I can't deny the performance boost in both Borderlands and Destiny. Now, Division had the CPU pegged at 100% using x264. We didn't see a drop in frames. Now, I still think it would be worthwhile swapping over to NVENC just to regain some of those CPU resources so we could add some more interactive elements to our stream. Overall, I got to say, I really thought x264 was going to come out on top, and I thought I was proving a point. In fact, what these series of tests have done, I think have made me change my mind and possibly reconsidered what I'm going to use for streaming from now on. You know, my old way of thinking was if you have the cores, throw the software at it. And that may still be true with higher core count CPUs. But for now, I think I'm going to swap my settings over to NVENC and see how stream looks over the next couple weeks. These are definitely the types of videos that I enjoy creating. So if you like the content, please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know what encoder you're using and what's your CPU and GPU. Are you using a CPU that has more than 8 cores with NVENC, or are you sticking with x264? Let me know what you thought of my findings. I'd really love to hear the feedback. You know, we're going to keep diving into some of these real world scenarios to see just how these technologies hold up in real world gaming. If you want to get in touch with me, or if you want to carry on the conversation, you could follow me on Twitter. You could join the Discord. Additionally, you could stop in on Twitch, where I'm streaming Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific at the link down below. Hope to see you there.